two.
Hello, my name is Jim Thornton. I am here today representing the Sergeant Alfred B. Hilton Memorial Fund Committee. And it's really an honor for me to share with you a project that we've been working on now for several months. So let me, if I may, just provide you a little bit of context around how the organization itself became an organization, a 501c3. So several years ago, maybe 9 or 10 years ago, and as I recall, a number of individuals became aware through some research that had been completed by a local historian, Jim Christopher, about this individual who had served in the Civil War in the United States Colored Troop, or I'll refer to it as USCT as we go forward. And as a result of this becoming aware that this individual had served in the Civil War, a local individual from the Level Hopewell area of Harford County, and he had been awarded the Medal of Honor. And we were really intrigued by the fact that we had never heard that history before. And as I recall, the sequence of events is that subsequently Post 55, which is an American Legion post here in Bel Air, Maryland, decided to rename the post in honor of Sergeant Alfred B. Hilton. And then a number of us, led by, at that time, Councilman Curtis Beulah, we formed the Sergeant Alfred B. Hilton Committee. And since that time, 8, 9, 10 people have been really dedicated to trying to elevate the awareness of Sergeant Alfred B. Hilton. And so we give a lot of that credit to Jim Christopher, who is a local historian, and then the number of citizens who became aware and said we need to find ways to really tell the larger community about the life and, of course, the ultimate sacrifice of Sergeant Alfred B. Hilton. So that ultimately led me to Jim Christopher. So Jim and I at one point had a conversation over coffee, and I said, Jim, have read your historical bulletin. And so how did you, and where do you have all this data that you've researched relative to the individuals from Harford County that actually served in the USCT? And he indicated to me at that point that he had basically created index cards relative to, that was his primary source of where he was really retaining this information. And one of the initiatives that I had been discussing with other members of the committee is that we needed to create a searchable database. So, over and beyond Sergeant Hilton, we know there were other people serving from Harford County. And so for future historians or just researchers or individuals interested in the history of African Americans who served here from Harford County, where would they turn to get this information? And so I said, Jim, let me take this on as a project to see if we can find funding in order to complete this research project in terms of creating this searchable database. So that led me to the Drescher Foundation. And I'd like to just take this opportunity to acknowledge the Drescher Foundation for underwriting the research cost that would be incurred to do this work. And so what we're hopefully going to accomplish today is to kind of take the audience through the sequence of events. And I think something that we feel very good about relative to where we are in this particular project. The goal, as I indicated earlier, is for future generations to be able to not only to understand the contribution that Sergeant Alfred B. Hilton made, but also the other individuals that served in the USCT, which is unfortunately probably not as well known relative to the contribution that they made during the Civil War. As a matter of fact, some historians would make the point that had Lincoln not made the free and formerly enslaved people eligible to serve during the 64 time frame, that the Union potentially would not have won the Civil War. And that's that speculation, and I'll let the historians kind of ultimately weigh in on whether that's right or wrong. But that's the importance of the USCT as it relates to the Civil War. And so we're hoping that the audience here will learn something. And this is really intended to help individuals to navigate ultimately the database that has been developed by one of my colleagues, Sue Nappy, and you'll meet her later, and she'll kind of take you through her phase of the research. But I think the first person we should hear from is our local historian, and he will share his story relative to how he got involved in terms of recognizing Sergeant Alfred B. Hilton as a local individual who is our native Harford County, the only native Harford County recipient of the Medal of Honor. So it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Jim Christopher.
Hello, my name is Jim Christopher. I was born and raised in Gettysburg, but I've lived in Bel Air since 1945, Harford County, and I've long been interested in social history and African American history. That goes back to my grade school days, and that continued all through college and graduate school, and then into my years I was teaching. I have retired 16 years ago after teaching for 40 years, mostly at John Carroll School in Bel Air, and all that while I was writing, researching, reading books, what have you, about local history as well as national history, and especially the Civil War era, including any aspect of African Americans. I've been a member of the Historical Society of Harford County for years. And in 1989, I walked in one day to the society when it was on Cortlandt Street, Cortlandt and Bond in Bel Air, Maryland, and a friend, a former civilian employee of the Proving Ground, James Roswell Dorsey, handed me this copy of a microfilm. And he didn't know what to make of it, and it was all out of context to me, but the key word was it did say something about Alfred B. Hilton, Sergeant Alfred B. Hilton would be awarded a Medal of Honor, and this was a statement from his commander, the Army of the James, General. Who? General, okay. General B. Butler. Thank you, I'm so sorry. And that set me off. Another friend, a fellow named Chris Weeks, when I started talking to him about that, he was the county preservation planner. He said, well, there's 3 or 4 guys like that in Harford County. I don't know anything about this Alfred Hilton himself, but if you go up to Green Springs Cemetery off Paradise Road in the Aberdeen area, Havre area really, and you'll find 2 or 3 members of the United States Colored Troops who are buried there. Well, one thing led to another, and what I thought was going to be a small project led to a much bigger one. And eventually I started, as researchers are trained to do, probably beginning in middle school, to record information that they expect to use for a talk or for a presentation of some sort. I began recording information on cards, and my card file at the time was just one of those old metal 4x5 card metal, maybe 3-4 inches deep, something like that. And here is Samuel Adams. And these are the A's, and of course it goes back to the Y's today. And we have over 200 cards today reflecting the men who were related to Harford County. Not all born, not necessarily all died in Harford County, but they have a major connection to Harford County. They may have been enslaved here, they may have retired here, whatever, something to do with Harford County. And so we now have over 200 members of the United States Colored Troops who are related to Harford County. And to compile these cards, Samuel Adams and James Adams, brothers from the Perryman area, they were in a 19th regiment of United States colored troops. Well, ultimately, two regiments of colored troops were dominated by Harford County had its largest contingent in two United States colored troop regiments, and that was the 4th United States colored troops, raised, as the number suggests, relatively early in the war, relatively early after Emancipation Proclamation, and then the 39th. Perhaps it is, sadly, the 39th that had the most people who died, and that's in part because of this major incident in the Civil War known as the mine at Petersburg. Well, it was, of course, Alfred B. Hilton who eventually really caught my attention because of learning, as I did in the course of my research, that he was born and raised in Harford County, Maryland, that he was a member of the 4th United States Colored Troops. He participated in a battle in the Civil War called the Newmarket Heights, and following the Battle of Newmarket Heights, that's where he was mortally injured. 16 men of a total of 17 African American men were awarded Medals of Honor. Hilton died about a month later at Fort Monroe, Virginia, in a segregated cemetery. Whites and black soldiers had been brought to Fort Monroe. Today, Alfred B. Hilton lies in a graveyard in Virginia near Hampton University. It's Hampton National Cemetery. And I've spent much of my time focusing on Hilton, but again, as I say, over 200 persons. And there's lots, we already know a lot, but we want to know more. And what these cards turned out looking like, and which Sue Nappy eventually got hold of and began starting to put them in proper shape. This is not a searchable database. I knew something about technology, so I was able to form this, categorize name, last name, owner, status at the time of the Civil War, and when they were born, when they died. And so we're looking not only to fill it in, but even what we have now, to have it be a searchable database. So lots to be known. And just as a little teaser, the Army cannot acknowledge that it ever awarded the medal to Alfred B. Hilton. I've had congressmen, I've had people at the National Archives, I've had people at the Library of Congress. None of them can find any record that the medal itself was ever awarded to Alfred B. Hilton. And what the rules, the statutes provided at that time is if the person were not there to receive the medal, and it was awarded, as it was for Hilton, posthumously, that the survivors would come to Washington, D.C. and come to the War Department, as it was called then, and claim it. Well, you're talking about a family of tenant farmers who owned a very small lot, and which eventually was foreclosed as the death of their parents. And not too much chance that they would ever learn about the medal, and that they, in fact, will ever be able to. So when talking to current day relatives, they never knew that Alfred B. Hilton received the Medal of Honor until researchers began looking at the microfilm. That's where we are now, and what we want to do is go forth and get that database up there, and maybe some people will learn from it. Maybe some people will say, find some more and say, oh, I know this man. James Adams, for example, he's buried in Wichita, Kansas. And there's a grave to him in Wichita, Kansas. And the lady did that and wrote me, and we took a picture off Find a Grave. And that's how we hope the database will work. A two-way sort of give and take They take from us and they also give to us. And ultimately, researchers and interested persons around the country will learn.
I'm Sue Nappy, and I'm a board member of the Alfred B. Hilton Memorial Fund. In the meeting, it came up in conversation on how Jim Thornton was looking for some help with a research project, and I volunteered to assist. He handed me a spreadsheets. I see mine are well thumbed from Jim Krismer's, and asked me to re-input this because over time it was done in 2002, and the original file was lost, so I re-input it into a spreadsheet. And then I started working on filling in the blanks of the spreadsheet. It also came to my attention through Jim that there was a book about African American cemeteries in Harford County written by Henry Peden, which was very helpful too, because any recordings of actual graves in Harford County, I was able to check that against what was on the spreadsheet, and I was able to collaborate between the two parts of research. So I'll just walk through the database. There's actually 253 records from that original from Jim Krismer. I started identifying, which ones were buried in Harford County. I tried to prioritize those because the committee wants to go and check out those graves and see make sure that they are attended to, that there is a headstone. If there isn't a headstone, get a headstone. If it needs to be repaired, get it repaired. So I prioritized those. This goes last name, first name, rank. I was able to, through research, now again, this is decades later after Jim's original research, and when I went online, I found out there's a lot of more information online that wasn't available when Jim's original research was done. And also there's AI too, and AI has been very helpful. But I've been able to get the service records of these soldiers, and I've been downloading that information too. So along with this giant spreadsheet, which is going to be searchable, we have the service records, the actual service records that are going to be accessible to anybody from anywhere, because it's all going to reside with the Harford County Historical Society on their website. So looking at the database, you can see the rank, the regiment, the status, if they were enslaved, where they enlisted, their height, when they were discharged, service notes, when they were promoted, if they were sent to a hospital, what they were sent for the hospital for, when they were discharged from the hospital, and then where they are buried. Do they have a USCT stone there? And if they are buried, if you've identified where they are buried, a link to it, and either through Find a Grave, which is an ancestry site, or through the Veterans Legacy Memorial page. I found quite a few there too. Occupation even. So I first concentrated on the ones from Harford County, then I will go down the spreadsheet, and then I have all the others that are not currently identified as buried in Harford County. Part of the problem is many of these soldiers, when they passed away, they didn't have the resources to buy a headstone, even though they would get a free headstone from the veterans. If they didn't have money, the family didn't have money to install it, they wouldn't have gotten it, or if there was from racial discrimination, they couldn't have gotten it. So there's a lot of soldiers that were unfortunately buried, and we don't know exactly where they are. So there's a next step after I've done this research is to try to get a hold of those cemetery records to see if we could positively identify them as buried in Harford County. And I suspect several of these on the spreadsheet were probably buried in Harford County. You can see where I have search not found online. There's another one that was found in Delaware. We're here from the Hampton National Cemetery in Hampton, Virginia. If I go to Hilton, I'm going to go down to his record because he is not buried in Harford County, but he's a Harford County native. Get down to his name. You see, I have him identified as a Medal of Honor. He's one of 14 children. He was buried in Hampton National Cemetery. And if you click on this link, go to Find a Grave, and you can see, a picture of his grave site and more information there. Go back to here. And as I'm going through it, there's a few that I haven't found that significant Harford County connection. I'm not taking them off the spreadsheet because it's possible I just don't know what that connection is. So I have a list at the end, the ones that as I've looked at the service records, their place of birth, where they enlisted, where they're buried, it seems outside the scope of Harford County, but I just may not have enough information at this point in time. So I just put them down there to save that record.
I'm really excited to be here with the two individuals that have been so critical to this project. To my right, of course, you met Sue earlier, and to my left is Jim, who is, as I keep referring to him, as our local historian. But Jim, let me start with you. Relative to you touched on earlier, kind of how early in your, I guess, even middle school or earlier than that, you became interested in African American history. And so, just for the audience, what is there particularly about African American history that you decided you wanted to focus on from a research standpoint? And since you spent so many years in John Carroll and teaching history, how did your students overall? Did you, as you got into that particular part of history, the Civil War, kind of what over the years? How did you approach that as a part of your kind of course instruction? And of course, that was earlier than your recognition of Sergeant Alfred B. Hilton. But of course, as you think about today, in particular in our country, with DEI and the attack the attack that has taken place about kind of that part of our history, I'd be interested in you kind of sharing your experiences earlier, as a person in the history field, and you work with young people and kind of the Civil War. So you could share that with us. I know that's probably multiple questions I raised there, Jim, but I really like to get some conversation going because I think that's important for the audience to kind of get your perspective. It's how did you get involved with, focus on Civil War and particularly African American history?
Well, first of all, as I think I said, I've always been interested in social history. People come to me and they ask about how many people died at Fredericksburg or Brandy Heights or something like that, and I have no clue. Or they might say, well, how many regiments did this corps have? Do Red Corps have regiments? And I don't know. But what I do know, what I'm interested in, is the social aspect of the Civil War. The role played by women, the impact on children in schools and things like that. Now, as far as the Civil War goes, my father was a professional journalist, but his avocation was the Civil War, to the degree that the biggest room in our house in Bel Air was his museum. And he didn't collect, cannonballs and guns and things like that. He collected music. Pieces of music. He collected carte visites. He collected prints and all those sort of things, letters, books, of course, he collected. But I definitely got my interest in Civil War through that means, and of course that also suggests, which is indeed the case, my mother used to take us around to historic sites. We've never been to a Disney place. We didn't go to Dutch Wonderland, but we didn't go to Disney places and places like that. We went to historical sites. And speaking of the Methodist Church on Singer Road, there's a picture of three Christmas boys sitting up on that step. You may never have seen that.
Oh, I haven't yet.
With the water pump still working, presumably. And, I guess that's it. I've always been interested in the underdog. And I suspect that if I were living in Minnesota, and this in fact is the case, because my wife did live in Minnesota, and every time we would go there, I would go in search of Native American sites. So I've always been interested in people, underclass, so to speak, minorities, women's history. And of course, the Civil War is rife with women's history. And I'm not just talking about those occasional women who happen to serve, they pass, so to speak, and serve as men in the Army. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does, Jim. The only point that perhaps you didn't touch on that would be helpful is kind of your students and your interaction, particularly as you went through, the years that you were in the school system, the part of the Civil War. What was kind of generally speaking, how your students kind of leaned into that discussion?
Well, that's a great point, Jim. And maybe I hope now the people who teach teachers in colleges teach them Your students will be interested in your life. Your students will be interested in your area. Now, I didn't have that good fortune. I didn't learn anything along those lines in my college. But I quickly discovered, since I taught 1 year at Aberdeen High School, and I began to tell them about where we were the day Kent State happened, for example. We were there at Kent State. And then I was able to tell them what happened other days and so forth and so on. They like to know, well, what about you? What did you do, Mr. Christopher, during this Vietnam War? And I was able to tell them other things. For example, my great-great-grandfather was taken prisoner. He was one of 8 civilians taken prisoners by the Confederates from the Battle of Gettysburg. And he was taken down at Salisbury Prison. And he came back to Gettysburg like about 2 months before the war ended. And the newspapers all said how wonderful he looked and healthy he looked. Well, of course, he was healthy enough that he lived 1 week and then died. But kids really get into that. And Rap Brown, which happened in Eastern Shore, but Rap Brown trial was changed to event by way of venue to Bel Air, Maryland, and eventually there was a tragedy and 2 men died in a bomb that went off south of Bel Air. And it was thought that those men were wanting to blow up the courthouse in which Rap Brown was to be tried. I can't remember the man's name, but that very, very, very famous criminal defense lawyer was there in Bel Air, and he was going to be the chief defense lawyer of Rap Brown. Rap Brown never came to Bel Air. He was going to come the day of the trial, but once that bomb went off the night before the trial. So you can tell them those sort of things. You can tell them about the Ku Klux rallies in Bel Air, in Aberdeen, in Havre, in Edgewood, and they really get into it. And they'll start telling you about their family. And in fact, that led me to say, oh my gosh, I should have them write a history. And so around the late 19th century, the Gilded Age, I gave them an assignment, gave them about a month, which included the time over Thanksgiving, and they were to research their family history and to come back with maybe 1,000, 2,000 words about their family history, and Poland and Italy and Czechoslovakia, as well as Ireland, what have you. So kids really got into that, and that's Civil War, of course, which is very popular, was a big part of all that.
Thank you so much, Jim, for sharing those thoughts. Let me turn to Sue, if I may. And Sue, I know that you took on this project relative to a need to identify and create a searchable database. And so I guess I'd be interested in you sharing with the audience kind of what is there about this project that has been perhaps the most challenging in terms of your discovery as you've gotten into this. What new knowledge has kind of surfaced for you, perhaps? And we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about where you grew up and kind of your experiences in high school, but it would be interesting, particularly if you have any thoughts around those classes in civil and U.S. history and your recollection of the Civil War and kind of when this whole definition of USCT, does that mean anything to you earlier, prior to your involvement with the Sergeant Alfred B. Hilton? So there's 4 or 5 questions in there, and I'll let you just kind of share with the audience your responses.
So I grew up in New Jersey, and I was always a very creative individual. So even though I had a strong math, science background, I went towards my creative side when I went to college. But when I think about history, I really don't remember much. And so as I've aged, I've come to realize how important history is, and really have enjoyed listening to lectures, whether it's on on TV or when we go on cruise ships, they have lecturers, and I really have enjoyed it. But I've also realized that even what I do remember of history, it wasn't much Black history. And I know women's history too. It wasn't much. So when I saw this project, and I have worked for the Army I had a career in the Army for 36 years as a civilian, and I've also worked for the Army Alliance, a nonprofit, for 8 years. So and we were very much an Army family. My husband was in the Army. My dad was in World War II. My son currently serving in the Army. So that attracted to me to the Sergeant Alfred B. Hilton, between the Army connection and wanting to know more about history, the Black history, especially with the Army. It was a double connection for me. And the research, I mean, since I'm not a trained historian, as I was going through things, I realized, oh, I should be recording this. And I had to go back to all the other records and start capturing it. So there was a lot of things I learned on the way, but learning is good, especially as you age. Create new neurons and new pathways. So I've enjoyed it because I have learned. And it's really been amazing, some of the things that I've written the service records about these individual soldiers. The things that they endured. I mean, they've been, today's world, you go in the hospital, you're in there for 10, 12 days, and then you come out, maybe you'll go to a rehab center, but their soldiers were in there for months suffering, and then dying at the end. And from things like typhoid pneumonia, dysentery, chronic diarrhea, intermittent fever. That's what they die of, because they just didn't have the medical, that we have today. So I'd say a little prayer every time I find one of those. And then when I find one of the soldiers where they're buried, it's like, I found you. I know where you are now. And everybody's going to know where you are now.
Yeah.
And that's a good feeling.
Well, thanks for sharing your experiences. As we wrap up here, I guess I'll just pose one question to each of you. What Jim, would you like for the people who will hopefully access this database and become more aware of these 200 plus people that are captured in this database? What is your vision for how this information will be used, and how hopefully other researchers, other historians would build on kind of the work that's been completed? But what if you could write that script? What would it look like for you in terms of how this data would be used?
Well, I'll let my teacher self first provide the first answer. I was hired by Harford County Schools in 1969. I was hired to be their in-house African American historian. And by that, I mean, I was sent to Aberdeen, Maryland, deliberately, because Aberdeen, Maryland was one of the schools that was recently integrated, as was the county, relatively recently integrated. Took Harford County 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education. But they recognized the need to have somebody in the building who could speak to the children, the kids, about African American history. And I had taken a couple of non-credit courses, and I'd read lots of books. The very first book I ever bought with my own money. I can tell you the store where it was and how old I was, but it was Abe Lincoln, Log Cabin to White House. And but anyhow, I was asked to go out and to speak to the teachers at other schools besides Aberdeen and encourage them to get into this more, not as a separate course, but as appropriate. There were African Americans, and in 1920s, of course, it was significant nationally. We can find local too. And but I was encouraged to tell them. Now, when I remember this one occasion, I was speaking at Bel Air High School. In fact, what they had done, I was the speaker. And this was one of these in-service days, and they had brought every high school history teacher from Harford County, Maryland, to Bel Air High School. Here I am, first-year teacher, asked to get up and tell them what to do. And I knew what was going to be the first objection. I just knew. And so I gave my spiel on the importance of African American history and as part of American history. And we needed to show the whole story of our country. And this guy raised his hand. I knew what he was going to say. He said, well, none of us ever took any courses, and there's no materials. I don't ever want anybody to have to say that about Harford County and the people who fought in Harford County. I want, if that person gets uh, uh, moved from Alaska down to Harford County, Maryland in the year 2026, and he said, "Where do you find this stuff?" I want the department chair or whomever to say, "Go to that database."
That's a great answer, Jim. Thanks for sharing that.
And of course, I want older adults who, as with Sue, never heard about women's history and black history, because there's plenty of people out there. See, showing your age a little bit.
Thank you so much, Jim, because I think that sets up perhaps, Sue, your thoughts around kind of, you've touched the data, if you will. You've identified sources that weren't perhaps readily available when Jim was even doing some of his work. So for you, what's the takeaway here in terms of how you would like to see this rich information that you've pulled together in a searchable database? And I'm really so pleased to hear that, and I know you've been working with the contact at the Historical Society and their, willingness to kind of let this data reside within their world, because I think that's a logical place. So as we kind of wrap up here, what are your thoughts about the future use of this data?
I mean, making it readily available is very important. It's out there, but it's not connected right now. The service record is available through fold3.com, but you have to have access to the database. We're very lucky in Harford County. Right now on the library system, they're giving free access. But other places, they won't necessarily have that access to get those service records. It's all out there, but it all needs to be connected.
And it will, from an ease of use standpoint, and I know you shared with the audience when you were speaking about the work, will this be a relatively user-friendly search? If you could just maybe spend a few minutes, because sometimes people hear databases, technology, they get intimidated. So just reinforce, if you would, for the audience, the ease of the application.
So the Historical Society will load it up to their website, but basically it is a spreadsheet that is searchable. So you would type in, the name of the soldier that you're looking for or any other parameters, and it would find it in the spreadsheet. It'll also tell you whether the service record is available, and then the Historical Society would then, you'd contact them, and then you could get that copy emailed to you.
Very good. Well, let me, if I may, just wrap up by saying to Sue and to Jim, our sincere appreciation for all of the work here. I think that, at least from my perspective, the vision was that, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, if you really want to know about the role that African Americans played here in Harford County, serving in the USCT, that information would be readily available in a searchable database. And I'm really pleased to share with the audience that this work is getting close to completion, and we just wanted to take the opportunity to give you kind of firsthand the work that has been really accomplished by the two individuals to my left and right. Again, I just want to reinforce to the audience our deep appreciation to the Drescher Foundation for their willingness to support this initiative. Sue referenced this earlier, but the next step will be for us to physically visit these cemeteries. And really, I had a chance to meet Henry Peden, and he's done remarkable work in identifying these 23 African American cemeteries here in Harford County. And so, to our audience, if you're interested in terms of this project and you have any additional input, we have a website, the Sergeant Alfred B. Hilton, and our contact information is there. And we would really welcome anyone who's interested in this project and who would like to in any way make a contribution. So with that, again, thanks. Appreciate it very much.